For the past several years, I've made a habit of writing up two best-of lists. One detailing my top 10 new games of each year, and another my top 10 old games. Essentially, I want to highlight games that were new to me, even if some of them may have been, in fact, very old. Now, for the first time, I wanted to make a video record of my favorite games I played in 2024. I tend to play a lot of old games, and last year was no exception. I wrote about most of these titles in more detail over on my blog, which I have linked in the video description, but I wanted to start by highlighting my 10 favorite older games that I played last year. First up, at number 10, is a bit of an odd one because it's not even a video game. 12 Word Searches. This is, as the name would imply, a collection of word searches, and it was cool as heck because it kind of has some video game-esque mechanics. There are hidden rules and secrets to discover as you work through them, and despite only being, 12 word searches, all in all it took me a few hours to finish. This is a free thing you can check out over on itch.io, and if you enjoyed the puzzle solving of something like Fez or Tunic, I'd highly recommend it. Next, at number 9, is something that should be a bit more expected. Resident Evil Village. In a lot of ways, this game felt like a modern take on Resident Evil 4, and, releasing only a year or so before a literal modern remake of RE4, it holds a weird place in my mind. Mechanically, it's solid and a refinement of a lot of what RE7 did before it, and I love the progression of things, but what made this game stick with me was, oddly enough, its story. It was probably the Resident Evil game with the most compelling narrative, if only because its returning protagonist, Ethan, was a character I grew to love. It's a great game and the first of many Resident Evil games you're about to hear me rave about. Next on my list, in the number 8 position, is the first Yakuza game. Specifically, I'm talking about the Restored mod by Silwahan. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. The combat is a bit rough and it can be repetitive, but man does this game have heart. It's a bit of a precursor to the open-world minigame fest that a lot of the later 2000s and 2010s would end up being full of, but it still felt fun and fresh. It's essentially got RPG random encounters in the form of street fights and, combined with a strong story, it was just a really solid game that has me excited to see where the series goes from here. I already love Kiryu. Number 7 on my list is PT. There's more to this game than just a hallway, but they sure made a game about walking down a hallway absolutely nerve-wracking. The sound design, the lighting, the way it takes something familiar and twists it ever so slightly to make it unsettling. This glorified tech demo is a masterclass in horror, and it's a shame that it's confined to a finite amount of PS4s. Definitely seek it out if you have the opportunity. It makes for an unforgettable hour. Number 6 on my list was Silent Hill 4: The Room. It's a bit of an odd game, but I loved it. It's incredibly uneven, but the parts of it that are great are some of the best in the series. The back half of this game is essentially one long escort mission where you're traveling with someone with questionable AI. But the vibes and aesthetics of this game are second to none. The hauntings in the apartment, the uncomfortable voyeurism, even just the intro video, there are some standout sequences in this game. It may not be perfect, but it manages to carve out a unique identity for itself, and I have to respect that. Coming in at number 5 is the Resident Evil 4 Remake, or the RE4 Make as I like to call it. This is hands down the most engaging gameplay in the entire Resident Evil series thanks to parries and dodges and all kinds of weapons to play around with. Fights are a joy. Boss fights have been tweaked and, like the other remakes in the series, it takes an already strong foundation and builds on it in many ways. The story is essentially just RE4, but they've smoothed over some of its odder aspects and made it ever so slightly more grounded, so no mech chase, sadly. This is a fantastic addition to the franchise that manages to almost match the original, and that should be commended. Number 4 on my list is Silent Hill 3. Heather rocks. This game has a lot more going on than just Heather. It's a direct narrative sequel to Silent Hill 1 that plays and looks like Silent Hill 2, but the reason it's so high up on this list is Heather. She's a fun and energetic protagonist who's a breath of fresh air after the relatively stuffy characters of Harry and James, and that meant I wanted to see her happy. Because of that, the trauma and tragedy of her story hits even harder. This game's level design can get even more awkward than the other games, and overall the game's not without its own glaring flaws. But, as petty as this may sound, Heather makes it all worth it. She's that likable. Third on my list is the Resident Evil 2 Remake, or the RE2 Make. I love this game. It takes the bones of Resident Evil 2 and makes it play like something modern. It also adds a pursuer enemy in the form of a tyrant, or Mr. X as everyone calls him, who chases you through the game's environments and makes previously safe areas tense again. It's a fantastic change of pace when he comes into play, and it harkens back to the introduction of Crimson Heads in the first Resident Evil remake. Keeping you on your toes after you've cleared an area was a smart addition, and it's no wonder they kept this idea going for the RE3 remake and RE Village. The only reason it's not higher on this list is that I think I may actually still prefer the original. There were just some things that weren't carried over, and for as complete a package as this is, I wish they had been able to make zapping work, or to find a way to make the AB campaign dynamic as interesting as it was in that original. Still, this game is excellent for everything it does manage to translate. Up next, in second place, is Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. This game is great. VR made it even better. That, combined with a return to a classic-style mansion to explore, made for an excellent time. Ethan is sort of a blank slate in this compared to Village, but his commitment to finding his wife still makes him pretty endearing. It's a bit less complex and refined than Village, so I could understand your confusion as to why this is rated so much higher in my eyes. But the thing is, this game was unforgettable in VR. It's a bit silly to aim a gun with your face, yes, but once you get the hang of it, it becomes second nature and it helps you get even more immersed in the goings-on. Sure, I could have played some of the later Resident Evil games in VR if I had the hardware for it, but I don't, so I didn't. And my experience is ultimately the thing I'm rating here. This was the first major thing I played in VR and it made me a convert. When this technology is used well, it's fantastic, and, for whatever reason, this game is incredible in VR. Lastly, my favorite old game I played last year, Resident Evil 4. Is it any surprise this game is at the top of my list? While I love the remake and I think it's a wonderful game that improves on this in a few ways, it simply doesn't match up pound for pound compared to this in my eyes. There are some edges that get smoothed in the remake that I think add some wonderful character to this game, and, personally, I love how delightfully video gamey this one is. There's a purity to this that I have such a profound respect for. The combat, as stiff as it may be, flows like a light gun shooter, and, when dealing with the slow-moving enemies you fight in this game, popping heads feels just as satisfying as the improved combat from the remake. I think this might be my favorite game in the Resident Evil series. There is some tough competition, and for that reason this was my favorite old game I played in 2024. Now for the thing that I assume most of you are interested in, my new games list. The only real qualifications for games on this list are that they needed to be released in 2024, and I needed to play a significant amount of them. There were a few games this year that I started and didn't play enough of, or games I wanted to play but just never made the time for, and any of those could very easily have made the list. There were also a couple other games I played which just barely missed the cutoff for my top 10, but all in all this was a great year when it comes to games that I care about. To get things started, at number 10 is Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree. Elden Ring was my new game of the year when it came out in 2022, and this expansion is, essentially, just more Elden Ring. It has a ton of content in the form of a new map to explore, and it sidesteps the potential issue of existing characters being over-leveled by, effectively, sending everyone back to square one with its new progression system. There are other unique things about this DLC that are worth highlighting, but, ultimately, the things that make this DLC great are the same things that made the base game great. So if you enjoyed that, then you'll probably love this. I know I did. Up next at number 9 is a very cool game, UFO 50. It's essentially a compilation of NES-era games that never existed, running the gamut of genres from contemporary platformers to something anachronistic like a roguelike deck builder, but what makes it shine is that everything has a clear amount of care put into it. Not every game has clicked with me, and there were even a few that I actively disliked, but it's an incredible collection and such a worthwhile effort that it has to have a place on my list. It reminds me of when I would browse flash game websites and forums and play all sorts of things, and it's been a wonderful thing to chip away at. For a long while, this held a very high spot on this list, but since I haven't gone back to it the way I thought I might, it's only here at number 9. With that being said, I still consider it to be, potentially, the most impressive game of the year. There's just so much to play with. Next, at number 8, is a game I have very mixed feelings on, Dragon Age the Veilguard. On one hand, it's disappointing that they don't take choices from prior games into account, and the few that they do incorporate feel pretty half-baked. On the other hand, they made a fourth Dragon Age. They actually made a follow-up to Trespasser that delivers on everything that DLC set up. The combat is improved, the cast of characters is strong, and while there aren't a whole lot of big decisions to make, the few that are there are difficult and compelling. This may not be the BioWare of old, but whoever this current team may be, they've proven that they can still make compelling stories that feel like the BioWare we remember. I also don't want to ignore the fact that a major AAA RPG released with pretty good queer representation. That might not mean much to you, but it meant a lot to me. Also, the hair in this game looks incredible.
No, we just... well...
Just look at that.
we have to, right?
Coming in at number 7 is Crow Country. This game is clearly a love letter to the survival horror genre, but what makes it so remarkable is that it delivers on everything you want it to deliver on. It's a game clearly inspired by Silent Hill and Resident Evil, and is full of all the puzzles and exploration you'd expect from something in that vein. As someone who loves those games, it was a joy to play something so obviously inspired by them. Ultimately though, what works so well about this compared to some other things that have aped those is that it has its own unique vibe and atmosphere. It's not simply trying to be about a manor like Resident Evil, or personal trauma like Silent Hill. It's its own thing that just so happens to play and be similar to those existing games. It also has a story that's surprisingly coherent, and it all culminates in a satisfying and impactful conclusion. In the number 6 spot is the Silent Hill 2 remake, or, you guessed it, the SH2 make. While I still had a few doubts about this game due to Bloober Team's track record, I did my best to stay optimistic and my faith was, somewhat surprisingly, not misplaced. This is a remake of Silent Hill 2 and it manages to recapture and even stand alongside that original in a number of ways. Performances are different, so rather than directly competing with something beloved, they chose to go for a new direction with certain scenes, and I love that decision. There are certain things this game does better than the original, such as more responsive combat and boss fights that are actually fun, so while the rough edges to that original game gave it some character, what they've chosen to sand them off with was a suitable replacement. While I wish they'd re-release those original Silent Hill games so people can easily compare the two, this at least puts the franchise back in front of people in a positive light. This was an excellent experience. Up next in number 5 is Astro Bot, and man, this game is delightful. I recently played the prior two Astro Bot games and enjoyed them, and generally speaking this game is a bigger and better version of those. The structure and level design is very reminiscent of Astro Bot Rescue Mission, the VR game, while the devotion and reverence for PlayStation as a brand is something that began with Astro's Playroom. While I understand that nostalgia bait like this may not be for everybody, I am absolutely in their target market and I'm not above being pandered to. Getting to see glimpses of games and franchises that have long been dormant was nice, even if I sort of agree with the criticism that this game is a bit of an IP graveyard. Even outside of all that, this is a solid, fun platformer where each level usually has some sort of gimmick. There are stages based on a few key PlayStation franchises, yes, but there are also wholly original levels where you're slowing down time to jump on projectiles or inflating yourself like a balloon to reach higher and higher platforms. There's so much novelty and invention in this game that I understand why it's gotten the praise it has. Plus, I get to make my little guy look like Sly Cooper. Sly Cooper! How cool is that? Number 4 on my list is something I played recently and was quickly enamored with. CONSCRIPT. This game is kind of the other side of the same coin as Crow Country in that it's also inspired by survival horror classics, but this is a much more combat-focused title than that. It largely evokes the earlier Resident Evil games with its exploration and puzzle solving, though it has a merchant who adds a touch of Resident Evil 4 to the mix that I appreciated. The combat is engaging, the upgrades feel good, and the economy feels very well balanced. Above all, by being set during a battle during the First World War, it's an exercise in survival horror without a fantastical or sci-fi gimmick, and it works. The Great War is a setting that's always intrigued me, and this game does it justice. In the number 3 spot is a game that's an absolute blast to play, and that's Earth Defense Force 6. Much like Elden Ring earlier, this game is more of something I loved. EDF 5 not only topped my old games list back in 2019, it cemented itself as one of my all-time favorite games, and this game is, quite literally, a direct follow-up to that. I still haven't finished it, otherwise there's a chance it to be rated even higher, but I love this game so much. The series may not look like much to an outside observer, it may even have an undeserved reputation for looking bad, but it's a ton of fun largely because its lower fidelity means they're able to throw truly absurd amounts of things at you. There's a scale to battles in these games that nothing else I play really comes close to matching, and watching hordes of enemies bring your frame rate to a screeching halt counterintuitively feels great every time it happens. That's how you know your PC is really working for it. Next, in the runner-up position, is Dragon's Dogma 2. While I played some of Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen, and have a lot of respect for what that game set out to accomplish, I never finished it. So, when the sequel came out, I made a point to give it a fair shot and to not abandon it the way I did the original, and I'm glad I stuck with it. This is a massive gameplay-first RPG that's radically unlike most things I've played, and is filled with moments of discovery and invention. It's a sandbox in some ways, because you're given a variety of tools and then are thrown out into the world with those tools at your disposal. Each class tackles fights in a different way, and by running through all of them during my playthrough, the gameplay never became stale. To add to that, while the main plot may be a bit dull, some of the side content was incredibly memorable, and of course the ending stretch is fantastic. If you gave up on this game partway through, I implore you to get back to it and to try to make it to the final sequence, because some of the best things in this game are hidden behind a wall you'll only make it to after dozens of hours. It's not that the game was bad before that. I happen to really enjoy my time with the entire thing, but things just take a very cool turn at the 11th hour that you'll have to see to believe. Finally, at number 1 on my new games for 2024 list, is Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown. I'll admit that I don't play a whole lot of Metroidvanias, so my opinion on this subject might not be worth much, but I thought this game was immaculate. There's a really satisfying feeling of progression as you unlock new abilities, the core movement feels great, and it's all technically really well put together. The story is fairly compelling, but it's the presentation of the game in general that makes it fantastic. The art is striking and the cutscenes are well directed. Specifically, there's a flourish to a late game scene that I still find myself thinking about. This game was made with so much care, which makes it such a massive shame that the studio and team behind it were effectively disbanded. Ultimately, with any sort of list like this, it comes down to personal preference, and, for reasons I still don't fully comprehend, this locked itself in as my game of the year when I played it, and nothing since has been able to shake it from that position. All 10 of these games are wonderful, and the titles that didn't make the list were also really great, but this game stands above the rest in my eyes.